remember the day I moved in like it was yesterday. My car was packed to the brim with my belongings, each box labeled with the precision of someone desperate to create a semblance of control. It was a new chapter, a chance to leave behind the uncertainty and chaos that had defined much of my life. I had never thought I'd end up with someone like Mark, successful, steady, and 20 years my senior, but here I was, pulling into his wide driveway, staring at his sprawling house that looked more like it belonged in a magazine than in real life. Mark greeted me with his usual calm demeanor, his smile warm, but restrained. "Welcome home," he said, as he helped me unload the car. His house was immaculate, with polished wooden floors, neutral-toned furniture, and large windows that framed the perfectly manicured garden. It felt safe, like stepping into a cocoon where nothing could go wrong. For someone like me, who had spent her life chasing stability, this was everything I had ever wanted. As we unpacked, he introduced me to his stepson, Liam. "Liam's staying with me for a while," Mark explained, gesturing toward the young man who appeared in the doorway. "He's working on his photography projects." Liam was nothing like Mark. Where Mark was poised and polished, Liam had an air of quiet rebellion. His dark hair fell into his eyes, and his clothes were casually thrown together as if he couldn't care less about appearances. But it was his eyes that struck me, sharp, observant, as if they could see right through me. "Nice to meet you," I said, offering a small smile. He nodded, his lips curving into a polite, almost mischievous grin. He was polite but distant, as though he had already decided to keep me at arm's length. I didn't mind. It was only natural. I was just the new woman in his stepfather's life. Later that evening, as we sat on the patio, Mark poured me a glass of wine and asked if I was happy with how everything was shaping up. I assured him I was. This life, the stability, the comfort, the predictability, it was what I had dreamed of. Yet, as I glanced toward the garden where Liam was adjusting the settings on his camera, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. He was crouched low, his brow furrowed in concentration, and the way the golden light of sunset hit his face made him look almost otherworldly. "You into photography?" I asked casually when he joined us later. "It's more of an obsession," he admitted with a shrug. "I'm trying to build a portfolio." Mark chuckled. "He's always been talented. Maybe he could take some photos of you. You'd make a great subject." Liam glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "If you're interested." I laughed nervously. "I don't know about that. I'm not exactly photogenic." "Nonsense," Liam said, his tone light but his gaze steady. "It's all about the lighting." The conversation moved on, but his words lingered. I couldn't explain why they unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he was already imagining how he'd frame me through his lens. That night, as I unpacked the last of my boxes, I caught myself wondering what it would be like to see myself through his eyes. The thought made me uneasy, but also curious. The next morning, Liam caught me in the kitchen. I was still in my pajamas, a loose t-shirt and shorts, my hair pulled into a messy bun. I hadn't expected anyone to be up so early, least of all him. He leaned casually against the counter, sipping a cup of black coffee, his camera slung over his shoulder. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, clutching my mug of tea and feeling suddenly self-conscious. His eyes swept over me briefly, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that made me feel oddly visible. "I was thinking," he began, "about what my dad said last night. You know, about taking your picture." I raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to do that. I'd probably be terrible at it." He smirked, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes. "You'd be surprised. It's not about how you look. It's about capturing a moment. A feeling. It's hard to explain, but I think it'd be fun." I hesitated, feeling a strange mix of flattery and nervousness. "Well, I guess I could give it a try, but I'm warning you, I'm not a natural. Trust me," he said, his confidence unshakable. "I'll make it easy." Later that afternoon, we met in the garden. It was a warm day, and the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the grass. Liam carried his camera with the ease of someone who knew it like the back of his hand. He directed me to stand near the rose bushes, adjusting the angle and checking the light as he worked. "Relax," he said, noticing the stiffness in my posture. "You're not at a photo shoot. Just be yourself." I tried to follow his instructions, letting my arms fall to my sides and softening my expression. Liam moved around me, his camera clicking as he shifted positions. He was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration, but every now and then he'd pause to offer a quiet compliment. "Perfect," he murmured. "The way the light hits your hair, it's beautiful." I felt my cheeks flush, unsure if it was the sun or his words that warmed me. He moved closer, adjusting a strand of my hair that had fallen out of place. His fingers were light against my skin, but the brief touch sent a shiver down my spine. "There," he said softly, stepping back to take another shot. That's it. When we finished, he promised to send me the photos once he'd edited them. I thanked him, feeling oddly exhilarated, like I'd just done something far more daring than pose in a garden. That evening, as I settled into bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. Liam had sent me a folder labeled, "Simply for you." I opened it and scrolled through the photos. They were stunning, more than I had expected. He had captured me in a way I had never seen before. The way the light framed my face, the way my eyes seemed to hold secrets I hadn't even realized I had. It was all there, laid bare. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. But with that exhilaration came a flicker of unease. I couldn't pinpoint why, but it stayed with me long after I turned off the lights. A few days later, Liam caught me in the hallway as I was heading out to the garden. He was holding his camera again, the strap slung loosely over his shoulder. "Hey," he said, stopping me with an easy grin. "I was wondering if you'd be up for another session. I want to try something different this time." I hesitated, unsure why the request made my heart skip a beat. "Different how?" "I've been experimenting with studio lighting," he explained, gesturing toward his bedroom at the end of the hall. "It's nothing fancy, just a couple of lights and some backdrops I set up, but I'd love to see how it works with a real subject." I blinked. His bedroom? The thought gave me pause, though there was no reason it should have. He was an artist after all, and I was just helping him hone his craft. Still, the idea of being alone with him in such an intimate space felt charged, though I couldn't quite say why. "Okay," I heard myself say before I could overthink it. "Why not?" Liam's room was as unpolished as the rest of him. Books and magazines were scattered across the floor, and his desk was cluttered with papers and camera equipment. In the corner, he had set up a makeshift studio, 2 tall lights with umbrellas, a plain gray backdrop, and a stool positioned in the center. "Sorry about the mess," he said, pushing a pile of clothes off a chair so I'd have somewhere to sit. Creative chaos. I laughed nervously, taking in the space. "It's fine. I've seen worse." He gestured for me to sit on the stool, adjusting the lights and occasionally stepping back to check the framing. "Just relax," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is more about the lighting than anything else." I tried to follow his instructions, but there was something about the way he moved around me that made it impossible to relax. His presence was magnetic, his focus so intense it felt like the air in the room had thickened. He was close, closer than he'd been during the first session, and every time he leaned in to adjust the angle of my chin or brush a stray hair out of my face, I felt the heat of his proximity. "You're doing great," he murmured as he crouched in front of me, his camera clicking rapidly. "Turn your head a little to the left. Yeah, like that. Perfect." His praise sent a strange thrill through me, and I hated how much I liked it. I hated how aware I was of him, the way his hands moved, the way his eyes never wavered from me. It was unnerving, but it also made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. At one point, he moved so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. "Hold still," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This shot's all about the eyes." I froze, my heart pounding as he adjusted the lens. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the lights and the soft click of the shutter. For a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of us, caught in a moment that felt both innocent and charged with something unspoken. When the session was over, he showed me a few of the shots on his camera. They were stunning, of course, but I could barely focus on the images. All I could think about was the way his fingers had lingered on my shoulder, the way his gaze had lingered on my face. "Thanks for doing this," he said as he walked me to the door. "You're really helping me out." "Anytime," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. As I stepped out into the hallway, my chest felt tight, like I was carrying a secret I didn't fully understand. I didn't expect to agree to another session, but a few days later, Liam brought it up again over breakfast. Mark was out of town for a work trip, and it was just the two of us at the table. He had his camera on the chair next to him, as if he'd been waiting for the right moment to ask. "I've been thinking about experimenting with a more intimate shoot," he said casually, pushing his cereal around with his spoon. "It'd be good practice for me, and I think you'd be perfect for it." "Intimate?" I repeated, my voice catching slightly. I knew what he meant, but the word hung in the air, thick and heavy. He nodded, his expression serious but not pushy. "Nothing crazy, just something that focuses more on emotion and vulnerability. Maybe something like a boudoir shoot." I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "I don't know if I'm really the boudoir type." "You don't have to be," he said, leaning forward. "It's not about being perfect or polished. It's about confidence, about seeing yourself in a new way." His words caught me off guard. Confidence was something I'd always struggled with, especially in my own skin. The idea of being photographed like that was terrifying, but there was a small, rebellious part of me that was intrigued, a part that wanted to see what he saw when he looked at me through his lens. I don't know, I said finally. I'd feel exposed. That's kind of the point, he replied, his tone soft. But only if you're comfortable with it. No pressure. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. His suggestion played on a loop in my mind, tugging at something I couldn't quite name. By the time the evening rolled around, I found myself knocking on his bedroom door. Okay, I said when he opened it, my heart pounding. Let's do it. His face lit up with a mixture of surprise and excitement. You're sure? I nodded, though I wasn't sure at all. Yeah, why not? He set up the studio again, this time adding a soft, warm light that bathed the room in an intimate glow. He handed me a robe and gestured toward the bathroom. Take your time, he said. Wear whatever makes you feel comfortable. I closed the door behind me and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My hands trembled as I slipped into the robe, leaving the straps of my camisole visible underneath. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel vulnerable. When I stepped back into the room, Liam was adjusting his camera settings. He looked up, and for a moment, his gaze lingered on me in a way that made my cheeks flush. But he didn't say anything. He just motioned for me to take a seat. Okay, he said, his voice calm and steady. Just sit how you feel most natural. Don't worry about posing. I'll guide you. At first, I felt awkward, hyper-aware of every movement, every angle. But as Liam worked, his voice was gentle and encouraging, and I began to relax. He adjusted the lighting, changed the angles, and occasionally stepped closer to reposition my hand or tilt my chin. You're doing amazing, he said at one point, his voice low, just like that. There was a moment when he leaned in to brush a strand of hair out of my face, his fingers grazing my cheek. I froze, the air between us suddenly charged. He didn't pull away immediately, his eyes meeting mine for just a second too long before he cleared his throat and stepped back. Sorry, he muttered, his voice strained. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't, I said quickly, though my pulse was racing. The rest of the session passed in a blur, my emotions a chaotic swirl of nerves, exhilaration, and something I didn't want to name. When it was over, Liam walked me to the door again, his expression unreadable. Thanks for trusting me, he said softly. I'll send you the photos once they're ready. As I walked back to my room, my legs felt shaky. I told myself it was just the adrenaline, but deep down I knew better. The following days passed in a haze. I went about my routine as usual. Grocery runs, tidying up the house, texting Mark while he was away, but I couldn't shake the memory of that session in Liam's room. It replayed in my mind in fragments. The warm glow of the lights, the way his voice softened when he spoke, the fleeting brush of his hand against my cheek. I felt restless, unsettled in a way I couldn't explain. At dinner one night, with Mark back home and the three of us seated around the table, I caught Liam watching me. It was subtle, barely noticeable. A glance here, a lingering look there, but it was enough to send my pulse racing. I tried to focus on the conversation, nodding along as Mark talked about his business trip, but I could feel Liam's gaze like a physical weight. Everything okay? Mark asked, his brow furrowing slightly. Yeah, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Just tired. After dinner, I offered to clean up while Mark went to his study. Liam stayed behind, leaning against the counter as I loaded the dishwasher. The silence between us was thick, almost stifling, and I found myself hyper-aware of his presence just a few feet away. You've been quiet, he said finally, his tone light but probing. Did the photos turn out bad or something? I glanced over at him, wiping my hands on a dish towel. No, they were amazing. I've just been busy, that's all. He smirked, crossing his arms. You're a terrible liar. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he stepped closer, close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes searched mine. If I made you uncomfortable the other night, I'm sorry. You didn't, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Good, he said, his gaze dropping briefly to my lips before flicking back to my eyes, because I've been thinking about it, a lot. My breath hitched, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. His words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous, and I knew I should say something to diffuse the tension, to push him away. But instead, I just stood there, frozen in place as his fingers brushed against the back of my hand. The sound of Mark's footsteps in the hallway snapped me back to reality. I pulled my hand away quickly, my heart pounding as Liam took a step back, his expression unreadable. Mark appeared in the doorway a moment later, oblivious to the charged silence that had just filled the room. You guys still in here? He asked, glancing between us. Just finishing up, I said, forcing a smile. My voice sounded strained, even to my own ears. Mark nodded, leaning against the doorframe. You should call it a night. You've been doing so much lately. You deserve a break. I nodded, grateful for the excuse to escape. As I headed upstairs, I didn't dare look back at Liam, but I could feel his eyes on me all the same. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind a tangled mess of guilt and longing. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment, a harmless spark that didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better, because sparks like that, they have a way of catching fire. The next few days were awkward, at least on my end. I avoided being alone with Liam as much as possible, busying myself with errands, chores, and spending time with Mark. It was an attempt to bury the tension that had been building between us, to convince myself that whatever was happening wasn't real, but avoidance only seemed to make it worse. Liam, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. If anything, he was more confident, his demeanor easy and assured, as if the charged moment in the kitchen had never happened, or maybe as if it had emboldened him. His casual remarks during family conversations were laced with subtle undertones, little comments that only I seemed to catch. It was maddening, like he was playing a game I didn't fully understand. It all came to a head one sunny afternoon. Mark had gone into the city for a meeting, leaving Liam and me alone in the house. I was reading in the living room when Liam appeared, camera in hand. "There's this spot I've been wanting to shoot at," he said, his voice carrying an edge of excitement. "It's just a few minutes walk from here. Thought you might want to come." I hesitated, the logical part of me screaming to say no, but there was a pull I couldn't resist, a curiosity that overpowered my better judgment. "Okay," I said finally, closing my book. "Let me grab my shoes." The spot he mentioned turned out to be a small clearing near the edge of the property, where the trees parted to reveal a view of rolling hills and a narrow creek winding its way through the landscape. It was beautiful, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. "Wow," I murmured, taking it in. "This is perfect." Liam smiled, pleased by my reaction. "It's my favorite spot to shoot. The light here in the late afternoon is unreal." He set up his camera, directing me to stand near the creek. The familiar routine of posing for him felt grounding, a way to focus on something other than the tension simmering just beneath the surface. But as the session went on, the atmosphere began to shift. His instructions became softer, more personal, his compliments lingering in the air like smoke. "Your profile in this light," he said, stepping closer. "It's stunning." I felt the heat rise to my cheeks and I laughed nervously, trying to deflect. "You make it sound like I'm a work of art." "You are," he said simply, his eyes locking onto mine. The words hung between us, heavier than I was ready to handle. Before I could respond, he moved closer, his camera dangling at his side. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low and raw. "I know I shouldn't say that, but it's the truth." "Liam," I began, my voice trembling. We can't." "I know," he said, but there was no regret in his tone, only defiance. "But that doesn't stop it from being real." The air around us felt electric, the weight of his words pressing against me. I wanted to step away to create distance, but my feet refused to move. Instead, I stayed rooted in place as he reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of birds, it all faded away until there was only him, his touch, and the unspoken pull between us. And then he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss so brief it could have been a mistake. But it wasn't. The deliberate hesitation, the way his breath lingered against my skin, it was intentional, undeniable. I stepped back, my heart racing. "I need to go," I said, my voice shaky and barely audible. He didn't stop me. He just stood there, watching as I turned and hurried back toward the house, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a storm cloud. Back in the house, I paced the living room, my thoughts spinning out of control. The kiss had been so brief, so fleeting, yet it felt monumental, like a boundary had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. I didn't know what to feel. Guilt, excitement, fear, all of it swirled together in a storm I couldn't calm. I tried to distract myself by cleaning, scrubbing the countertops until my arms ached. But no matter what I did, my mind kept returning to the way Liam's lips had felt against mine, the warmth of his breath, the intensity in his eyes. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong, but it also felt alarmingly right. That evening, when Mark came home, I tried to act normal. I greeted him with a smile, asked about his day, and made dinner like nothing had happened. But my hands shook as I chopped vegetables, and I found myself avoiding Liam's gaze whenever he walked into the room. At dinner, Mark was his usual affable self, oblivious to the tension crackling between me and his stepson. He told stories about his meeting, joked about a coworker's incompetence, and offered me a glass of wine, which I accepted eagerly. The alcohol helped dull the edge of my nerves, but it couldn't erase the weight pressing down on me. Liam, on the other hand, was quieter than usual. He contributed to the conversation here and there, but his responses were short, his tone subdued. Every so often I'd catch him glancing at me, his expression unreadable. It was as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge what had happened, to give some indication of what I was thinking, but I couldn't. Not here, not now. After dinner, Mark retired to his study to catch up on emails, leaving me alone in the kitchen with Liam. The silence was deafening as I washed the dishes. My back turned to him. I could feel him hovering nearby, his presence as palpable as a physical touch. "Are we just going to pretend that didn't happen?" he asked finally, his voice low and strained. I froze, my hands submerged in soapy water. "We have to," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's no other option." He stepped closer, the sound of his footsteps soft against the tile floor. "You felt it too. Don't tell me you didn't." I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "It doesn't matter what I felt. It was a mistake, Liam. It can't happen again." He frowned, his jaw tightening. "Why not? Because of him?" He gestured toward the study, his voice laced with frustration. "Do you even love him?" "Of course I do," I snapped, though the words felt hollow. He's good to me. He's everything I've ever wanted." "Then why are you here, talking to me instead of with him?" Liam challenged, stepping closer. "Why can't you stop thinking about this?" I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out, because he was right. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and that terrified me. "This has to stop," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I'm with Mark. I chose this life because it's what I need, and you need to find someone your own age, someone who—" "Don't," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "Don't make this about age or practicality or whatever excuse you're trying to use. This is real, and you know it." I turned away, tears stinging my eyes. "Just leave me alone, Liam, please." He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then I heard him sigh, the sound heavy with resignation. Without another word, he walked away, leaving me alone in the kitchen, my hands still submerged in water that had long gone cold. That night, as I lay in bed, I told myself it was over. Whatever this thing was between us, it had to end before it destroyed everything. But even as I made that resolution, I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest, the lingering pull that refused to let me go. The next morning, I woke up to find the house unusually quiet. Mark had left early for another business trip, and the absence of his presence made the house feel larger and emptier than usual. I tried to savor the stillness, to use the solitude as a chance to clear my head, but instead, I found myself on edge, hyper-aware of Liam's presence somewhere in the house. I avoided him for most of the day, retreating to my room or the garden to keep my distance. I needed time to think, to make sense of the mess I'd gotten myself into. But by evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, I found myself lingering near the staircase, listening for the faint sounds of movement from his room. When Liam finally emerged, it was almost as if he'd been waiting for me too. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his camera slung over his shoulder, and his eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence stretching between us like a fragile thread. "I'm heading out to shoot," he said finally, his voice neutral. "There's a spot by the creek I've been wanting to try at sunset." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to let him go, to stay behind and keep the distance I'd promised myself to maintain. But another part, the part I was desperately trying to suppress, wanted to follow him, to see if the tension between us could somehow be resolved, even if I didn't know what resolution looked like. "Do you want company?" I asked before I could stop myself. He looked surprised, but he nodded. "If you want, I could use the help carrying some gear." I grabbed a light sweater and followed him outside, the cool evening air brushing against my skin as we made our way to the creek. Neither of us spoke much during the walk, but the silence didn't feel awkward. If anything, it felt heavy with anticipation, as though we were both waiting for something to happen. When we reached the clearing, Liam set up his tripod and adjusted his camera. I stood off to the side, unsure of what to do with myself. I watched as he worked, the fading sunlight catching in his hair and casting a warm glow across his face. There was something about his focus, his quiet determination, that was magnetic. "Can you hold this for me?" he asked, handing me a reflector. He guided me to stand at a specific angle, showing me how to tilt the reflector to bounce light onto the subject he was framing. As I held it, he stepped closer, his hands brushing mine as he adjusted the angle. The brief contact sent a jolt through me, and I bit my lip, trying to ignore the flutter in my chest. "Perfect," he said, stepping back to look through the viewfinder. "Stayed just like that." We fell into a rhythm, the practicalities of photography providing a buffer between us. But as the sun dipped lower and the golden hour light softened everything around us, the atmosphere began to shift. Liam glanced up from his camera, his gaze lingering on me in a way that made my breath catch. "Can I take one of you?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the reflector. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "It's just a photo," he said, his voice calm but insistent. "You look incredible in this light. Trust me, it'll be worth it." I nodded reluctantly, handing him the reflector and stepping into the frame. He directed me to sit on a fallen log near the creek, adjusting the angle of the camera as he worked. "Relax," he said, his tone soft. "Just be yourself." I tried to follow his instructions, but the intensity of his gaze made it impossible to relax. He wasn't just looking at me, he was studying me, seeing me in a way that made my skin tingle. When he lowered the camera and took a step closer, my breath hitched. "You're beautiful," he said, the words barely more than a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, tentative, but it sent a shiver through me all the same. "Liam," I said, my voice trembling. "We shouldn't." "I know," he said, cutting me off, "but I can't stop." And then, before I could stop him, or myself, he leaned in and kissed me. This time it wasn't brief or hesitant. It was deep and urgent, a kiss that stole the breath from my lungs and made the world around us disappear. I knew it was wrong. I knew it would complicate everything. But in that moment, with his hands on my waist and his lips on mine, I didn't care. The days that followed felt like stepping into another world, one where I was constantly teetering on the edge of something exhilarating and terrifying. Liam and I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and now every moment we spent under the same roof felt like a secret waiting to be discovered. We didn't talk about the kiss. Not directly. Instead, it lingered between us, unspoken but ever-present, like the hum of electricity in the air before a storm. Every glance, every accidental touch, every shared silence was charged with a tension that made it impossible to breathe. I told myself to stop, to put an end to whatever this was before it spiraled further out of control, but I couldn't. One evening, Mark was in his study, buried in paperwork, when Liam knocked softly on my bedroom door. My heart leapt at the sound, a mixture of excitement and dread flooding through me as I opened the door just enough to see him standing there. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder to make sure Mark was nowhere in sight. Then, against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let him in. He closed the door quietly behind him, his presence filling the small space like a storm cloud. "What are you doing here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted, his eyes locking onto mine. I needed to see you." His words sent a shiver through me, and I found myself leaning back against the edge of the bed, my knees weak. "Liam, we can't keep doing this," I said, though the conviction in my voice was fading fast. Mark doesn't see you the way I do," he interrupted, stepping closer. "He doesn't know what makes you light up, what makes you laugh. He doesn't look at you like you're the most incredible thing he's ever seen." "Stop," I said, though my voice lacked any real force. "You can't say things like that." "Why not? It's the truth." His hand brushed against mine, his touch sending sparks up my arm. "You feel it too, don't you?" I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, but no words came out. Because he was right. I did feel it. The pull, the connection, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was intoxicating, and it terrified me. He stepped even closer, so close I could feel the heat radiating off his body. His eyes searched mine, his expression raw and vulnerable. "Tell me to leave," he said softly. "If you really don't feel anything, tell me to walk out that door, and I will." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rational part of me screamed to tell him to go, to stop this before it was too late, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my fingers brushing against his. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. He closed the distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, as if he'd been holding back for far too long. The room seemed to spin as he pulled me closer, his hands settling on my waist. I clung to him, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts that I couldn't hold on to. All I knew in that moment was him, the taste of his kiss, the warmth of his touch, the way he made everything else fade away. We broke apart suddenly at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My breath caught as we froze, listening intently. The footsteps passed by without pause, and I exhaled in relief, my heart hammering in my chest. "I should go," Liam said, his voice reluctant but firm. I nodded, my hand still gripping the fabric of his shirt. "Yeah." He leaned in, pressing one last kiss to my forehead before slipping out the door. I stood there for a long time after he left, my mind racing and my body trembling. This was dangerous, reckless, and completely unsustainable. But as I sat down on the edge of the bed, I realized something that terrified me even more than the risks we were taking. I didn't want it to stop. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and suffocating guilt. Liam and I moved through the house like shadows, careful not to give anything away when Mark was around. But when we were alone, the tension between us burned too hot to ignore. We had become experts at sneaking around, whispered conversations in the kitchen while Mark was out running errands, fleeting touches in the hallway, and nights spent tangled together in Liam's makeshift studio, where the darkness hid everything we didn't dare say out loud. But the secrecy came at a cost. Every glance from Mark, every affectionate gesture, felt like a dagger to the chest. He trusted me, and I was betraying him in the worst possible way. I told myself I would end it, that I would put a stop to whatever this thing with Liam had become. But then, he would look at me, his gaze filled with a hunger that mirrored my own, and my resolve would crumble. One night, while Mark was out of town, Liam asked me to meet him in his studio. I hesitated, knowing how dangerous it was to keep pushing the boundaries like this. But when I saw the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, I couldn't say no. The room was dimly lit when I arrived, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Liam was waiting for me, his camera set up on the tripod, and a stool positioned in the center of the room. "You've been avoiding me," he said quietly, his tone more questioning than accusatory. "I haven't," I lied, though we both knew the truth. He stepped closer, his expression softening. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." "It's not that simple, Liam," I said, my voice trembling. "We're playing with fire, maybe," he admitted, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "But it doesn't mean it isn't worth it." I closed my eyes, his touch sending a shiver through me. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to be honest," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "With me. With yourself. Tell me what you want." I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. He was so close, his presence overwhelming. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped forward, closing the distance between us as my hands found his shirt, gripping the fabric like it was the only thing keeping me steady. "I don't know how to stop," I whispered, the admission breaking something inside me. "Then don't," he said simply, his hands settling on my waist. "Stay." The next thing I knew, his lips were on mine, and the rest of the world melted away. The kiss was slow and deliberate, filled with an intensity that left me breathless. He guided me to the stool, his movements careful, reverent, as if he was afraid I might vanish if he wasn't careful. "Let me photograph you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just you, the way you are right now." I hesitated, my pulse racing. "Liam, please," he said, his hands gently cradling my face. "I want to remember this. I want to remember you." Something in his voice broke through my defenses, and I nodded, my heart pounding as I let him position me in front of the camera. He worked quickly but carefully, his movements precise as he adjusted the lighting and framed the shot. "Beautiful," he murmured as the shutter clicked, his gaze never leaving mine. "You have no idea how incredible you are." His words made my chest tighten, a strange mix of elation and despair flooding through me. I wanted to believe him, to let myself fall into the fantasy he was offering, but reality loomed like a shadow, a constant reminder of the life I was risking for something I couldn't even define. When the session ended, Liam pulled me into his arms, his embrace grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. We stayed like that for a long time, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. As I left his room that night, slipping back into my own bed, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was guilt, but deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. It was longing. It didn't take long for Mark to notice the changes in me. He wasn't the kind of man who missed details, and as much as I tried to mask my inner turmoil, there were cracks in my facade I couldn't fully hide. "You've been distracted lately," he said one evening as we sat on the patio. The twilight sky was streaked with lavender and gold, but the beauty of it barely registered. I was too preoccupied, my thoughts tangled in a web of guilt and longing. "Work's just been stressful," I lied, stirring my tea. I didn't even have a job, but I hoped he wouldn't press further. Mark tilted his head, studying me with a look that made me squirm. "You can tell me if something's wrong, you know. I don't want you to feel like you have to handle everything on your own." "I'm fine," I insisted, forcing a smile. "Really?" He nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't entirely believe me. I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest, and for a moment, I wondered if I could salvage this, if I could somehow find my way back to the life I had chosen with him. But even as I thought it, the memory of Liam's touch lingered, vivid and undeniable. The tension came to a head later that week during dinner. The three of us sat around the table, Mark recounting a story about an old college friend, but I could barely focus. Liam sat across from me, his leg brushing mine under the table. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it set my nerves alight. When I glanced up, his eyes met mine, and the look he gave me made my heart stutter. It wasn't overt or obvious, just a flicker of something that passed between us, hidden in plain sight. I quickly looked away, focusing on my plate, but the damage was done. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. Mark noticed my silence and reached for my hand. "You okay?" he asked, his tone full of concern. "I'm fine," I said quickly, pulling my hand away under the pretense of adjusting my napkin. I could feel Liam watching me, and the weight of it was unbearable. After dinner, I retreated to the kitchen to avoid lingering too long in the same room with both of them. I busied myself with washing the dishes, the rhythmic motion a small comfort in the chaos of my mind, but it wasn't long before Liam appeared, leaning against the doorway. "You're playing with fire," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough edge to make my chest tighten. I didn't look at him. "I could say the same to you." "You didn't tell him," he said, stepping closer. "About us." I turned to face him, my hands still wet from the sink. "What exactly do you want me to tell him, Liam? That I've been sneaking around with his stepson? That I'm the worst person he could have chosen to trust?" His expression softened and he moved closer, his presence filling the small space between us. "You're not a bad person. You're just caught between two things you can't let go of." I let out a bitter laugh. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he admitted, his hand brushing against mine. "But that doesn't make it any less real." The sound of Mark's voice calling from the other room made us both freeze. I pulled my hand away quickly, stepping back as guilt surged through me. Liam looked at me for a moment longer before retreating, leaving me alone with the sound of my heartbeat thundering in my ears. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the walls closing in. Mark was starting to suspect something, even if he didn't know what, and Liam was becoming bolder, his actions fueled by an undeniable pull that mirrored my own. I was caught in a spiral, and the more I tried to stop it, the faster it seemed to spin. The house had become a battlefield of unspoken words and growing tension. Mark's subtle but pointed questions, Liam's lingering gazes, and my own internal turmoil were suffocating. I felt like a live wire, ready to snap at any moment. And yet, as dangerous as it all was, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. One afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen, flipping through a cookbook as a distraction. Though the words blurred together on the page, Mark had gone into town, leaving Liam and me alone again. It had become a pattern. These stretches of time where we were left unsupervised, and the pull between us only intensified. I was startled when I turned and found Liam standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. His presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore, and I felt my pulse quicken even before he spoke. "Come with me," he said simply. I hesitated, clutching the edge of the counter. "Where?" "Just away from here," he said, his voice low but insistent. "There's a place I want to show you." I should have said no. Every fiber of my being told me to stay put, to avoid feeding into the dangerous game we were playing. But instead, I found myself nodding. "Okay, let me grab my coat." The drive was quiet, the tension in the air thick but unspoken. Liam didn't tell me where we were going, and I didn't ask. I stared out the window, watching the countryside roll by, the fields bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Eventually, he pulled off onto a narrow dirt road that led to a small, secluded clearing. In the center stood an old abandoned barn, its weathered wood glowing softly in the fading sunlight. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost otherworldly, untouched by time. "What is this place?" I asked as we stepped out of the car. "I found it a few months ago while scouting locations for a shoot," he said, grabbing his camera from the back seat. "I come here sometimes when I need to clear my head." He led me inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under our weight. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of hay and earth, and shafts of sunlight streamed through the gaps in the walls, casting long golden beams across the space. "It's amazing," I said, my voice hushed. Liam smiled, setting his camera down on an old workbench. "I thought you'd like it." For a while, we just wandered the space, the silence between us comfortable but charged. Liam took a few photos, his focus shifting between the details of the barn and the way the light danced across the room. At one point, he turned the camera on me, and I froze. "Don't," I said, shaking my head. "Why not?" he asked, his tone soft but challenging. "You look perfect right now." "I'm a mess," I muttered, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You're not," he said, stepping closer. "You're real, and that's what makes you so beautiful." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my resolve slipping. When he reached out to take my hand, I didn't pull away. Instead, I let him guide me to the center of the room, where the sunlight pooled like liquid gold. "Just one photo," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find the strength to refuse him. He adjusted the camera, his movements slow and deliberate, and when he looked at me through the lens, It felt like he was seeing straight into my soul. "Stay like that," he murmured, the camera clicking softly. "Don't move." I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely at peace. It was as if, in that moment, nothing else mattered, just the way the light felt against my skin and the intensity of Liam's gaze. When he finally lowered the camera, he stepped toward me, closing the distance between us. "You have no idea how much you mean to me," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Liam," I began, but my words were cut off as he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and desperate. This time, I didn't pull away. We stayed in that barn until the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretching long and thin across the floor. And as we drove back to the house, the weight of what we had done settled over me like a blanket. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The next day, Mark suggested a weekend getaway, a chance for us to spend some time alone and reconnect, as he put it. I agreed, though the idea of being alone with him for an entire weekend filled me with a strange sense of dread. It wasn't that I didn't care for Mark. I did. But the thought of pretending everything was normal, of acting like my world wasn't falling apart, was exhausting. Liam was in the living room when Mark mentioned the trip, his expression carefully neutral as he fiddled with the settings on his camera, but I caught the flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of frustration and resignation that mirrored my own feelings. He didn't say anything as I packed my bags that evening, but the silence between us spoke volumes. The getaway was to a cozy bed and breakfast nestled in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and wildflowers. It was beautiful, picturesque, the kind of place that should have felt like a romantic escape. But as we settled into the quaint room with its floral wallpaper and antique furniture, I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. Mark was attentive, kind as always, but his concern for me was evident. Over dinner, he reached across the table and took my hand, his brow furrowed. "You've seemed distant lately," he said, his tone careful. "Is something going on?" My heart lurched, and I forced a smile. "I'm fine. I think I've just been stressed." "About what?" he asked, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "You can talk to me, you know. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." His sincerity cut through me like a knife. Here he was, offering me everything I had always wanted: stability, security, a future. And yet, all I could think about was Liam. The weight of my betrayal pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. "It's nothing," I said finally, pulling my hand away under the pretense of adjusting my napkin. "I just need some time to clear my head." Mark didn't push further, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles, and by the time we returned to our room, I was ready to collapse under the weight of my own guilt. But when I checked my phone later that night, I found a message from Liam waiting for me. "Liam, thinking about you." It was simple, unassuming, but it sent my heart racing. I stared at the screen, my mind warring with itself. I should have ignored it, deleted it, done anything but respond, but my fingers moved before I could stop them. "Me, you shouldn't be texting me, Liam, but you wanted me to." I closed my eyes, the truth of his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. I did want him to. As wrong as it was, I couldn't deny it. The next day, Mark suggested a hike through the nearby trails. It was the kind of thing I would have enjoyed under normal circumstances, but my mind was elsewhere. As we walked side by side, surrounded by the beauty of nature, I couldn't stop thinking about Liam, his voice, his touch, the way he made me feel like the most alive version of myself. At one point, Mark stopped to take a photo of the view, and I used the opportunity to check my phone. There was another message from Liam. "Liam, miss you." I felt a surge of guilt and longing all at once, and I quickly stuffed the phone back into my pocket before Mark noticed. But the damage was done. The text stayed with me, playing on a loop in my mind as we made our way back to the bed and breakfast. That night, as Mark slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I thought about Liam, about the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. I thought about Mark, about the life I had built with him and the stability he offered, and I thought about myself, caught between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I felt like I was unraveling, the weight of my choices pulling me apart at the seams. When Mark and I returned from the trip, I was exhausted in every possible way. The entire weekend had felt like a balancing act, my emotions a tangle of guilt and longing that no amount of charming countryside or kind gestures could untangle. Mark tried his best to draw me out, but his efforts only made me feel worse. He didn't deserve this, and I hated myself for what I was doing to him. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw Liam standing on the porch, his camera in hand. He looked up as the car came to a stop, his gaze locking onto mine for a split second before flickering to Mark. It was subtle, but I saw the tension in his jaw, the way he gripped the camera just a little too tightly. Mark waved at him as we got out of the car. "Get anything good while we were gone?" he asked, gesturing to the camera. "A few decent shots," Liam replied casually, though his tone was clipped. His eyes darted to me briefly, but he quickly looked away. I muttered something about unpacking and disappeared into the house, leaving Mark and Liam to talk on the porch. Once inside, I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving as I tried to calm the storm raging inside me. I couldn't keep doing this. Not to Mark, not to myself, not to Liam. Something had to give. Later that evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Liam walked in. Mark was in his study again, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge. I didn't look up as Liam approached, but I could feel his presence, the air between us crackling with unspoken tension. "How was the trip?" he asked, his voice low. "It was fine," I said shortly, focusing on chopping vegetables. "You don't sound like it was fine," he said, stepping closer. I slammed the knife down on the cutting board, finally looking up at him. "What do you want from me, Liam?" I snapped, my voice trembling. "Do you want me to say that I couldn't stop thinking about you the whole time? That I feel like I'm losing my mind because I don't know how to stop wanting you?" His eyes softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "I don't want you to stop," he said quietly. "I want you to be honest with yourself, with me." "Honest?" I let out a bitter laugh. "What good does honesty do when everything about this is wrong? Does it feel wrong?" he asked, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out, because the truth, the terrible, undeniable truth, was that it didn't feel wrong. Not when I was with him. Not when he looked at me like that. Like I was the only thing that mattered. He stepped closer, his hand cupping my cheek. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said gently. "But you can't keep pretending this isn't real. Not to me. Not to yourself." Before I could respond, the sound of Mark's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Liam stepped back quickly, his expression shifting to something neutral, but the tension in the room didn't dissipate. Mark appeared in the doorway a moment later, glancing between us. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just talking about Liam's photos." Mark nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Dinner smells good," he said, stepping into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. As he turned away, I glanced at Liam. His eyes met mine, and in that brief moment, I knew he was right. I couldn't keep pretending. Something had to change. But the thought of what that might mean left me feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss. The days that followed were unbearable. The weight of what was happening pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. I avoided Liam as much as possible, hoping that distance would dull the intensity of my feelings. But every time I caught sight of him, whether it was a fleeting glimpse in the hallway or the sound of his voice drifting from another room, my resolve faltered. Mark began to notice my unease. He wasn't the kind of man to push, but his concern was palpable, and his attempts to reach out only made the guilt weigh heavier on my shoulders. One evening, he confronted me. We were sitting on the couch, a movie playing in the background that neither of us was paying attention to. Mark muted the TV and turned to face me, his expression serious but kind. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said, his tone gentle. "And I don't mean physically. It's like, you're not here with me." I froze, my heart pounding. "Mark, you don't have to explain," he interrupted, shaking his head. I need to know if I've done something wrong, if there's something I can fix." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't angry or accusatory, just hurt, and that made it so much worse. I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You've been nothing but wonderful." "Then what is it?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Because I feel like I'm losing you and I don't even know why." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain what was happening? How could I tell him that the life I thought I wanted, the life he had so generously given me, was no longer enough? Before I could find the courage to say anything, Liam walked into the room. He froze when he saw us, his eyes darting between Mark and me. The tension in the room was suffocating, and for a moment, none of us said anything. "Sorry," Liam said finally, his voice stiff. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," Mark said, though his tone lacked its usual warmth. He glanced at me one last time before standing. "I need some air," He left the room without another word, leaving me alone with Liam. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could feel Liam's gaze on me, heavy with unspoken questions. "What was that about?" he asked, his voice soft. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. He knows something's wrong. He doesn't know what, but he knows. Liam stepped closer, his expression filled with concern. "Do you want to tell him?" "I don't know what I want anymore," I admitted, my voice breaking. "All I know is that I can't keep living like this. It's tearing me apart." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently, "but you can't keep punishing yourself for feeling something real." I pulled my hand away, standing abruptly. "It's not that simple, Liam. You don't understand what's at stake." "Then tell me," he said, his tone firm. "Help me understand." But I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, and all I could do was shake my head. Without another word, I turned and left the room, retreating to the safety of my bedroom. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of my choices pressed down on me like a crushing tide. I was standing at a crossroads, and no matter which path I chose, someone was going to get hurt. The breaking point came one evening, when the tension in the house became too much to bear. Mark had left for a late meeting, and I found myself alone with Liam again. I was in the kitchen, staring out the window at the fading light, when he walked in. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. I turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest. "What do you expect me to do, Liam? This can't go on." "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. His tone wasn't angry, it was pleading. "You can't keep pretending this isn't happening, that you don't feel it." "I know what I feel," I said, my voice trembling. "But it doesn't change anything." Mark doesn't see you the way I do," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "He doesn't make you feel alive, does he?" "That's not fair," I shot back, tears stinging my eyes. "Mark is a good man. He's given me everything I thought I wanted, but it's not enough," Liam said, his words cutting through me like a blade. "You wouldn't be here with me if it was." The truth of his words hit me like a tidal wave. I wanted to deny it, to argue, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he was right. The life I had built with Mark was safe, stable, but it wasn't enough. Not anymore. "I hate this," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I hate what this is doing to me, to all of us." Liam stepped closer, his hands gently gripping my shoulders. "Then stop fighting it," he said, his voice softening. "Stop pretending you don't want this." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it, the weight of my guilt and fear melting away under the heat of his touch. But then the sound of the front door opening jolted us apart. Mark was home. Panic surged through me as I stepped away from Liam, my heart racing. He looked just as shaken, but he quickly composed himself, grabbing a glass from the counter and filling it with water as if nothing had happened. Mark walked into the kitchen a moment later, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Hey," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "How was your evening?" "Fine," I said quickly, my voice higher than usual. "Just quiet." His gaze shifted to Liam, who was leaning casually against the counter, sipping his water. "What about you?" Mark asked, his tone friendly but with an edge I couldn't quite place. "Anything exciting happened today?" Liam shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Nothing worth mentioning." Mark nodded, but his eyes lingered on Liam for a moment too long. My stomach churned as I realized that he wasn't as oblivious as I'd hoped. He wasn't outright suspicious yet, but he wasn't entirely unaware either. As the evening wore on, the air in the house grew heavier, the unspoken tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark seemed distracted, his eyes flicking between Liam and me more often than usual. I couldn't tell if it was paranoia or guilt, but I felt like he was watching us, piecing together the puzzle. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the walls closing in. Mark's presence beside me was comforting and suffocating all at once, and the thought of facing Liam again the next day made my chest tighten. Something had to give. We couldn't keep going like this, pretending everything was fine when the foundation of our lives was crumbling beneath us. The storm was coming, and I wasn't sure any of us would make it out unscathed. The morning after, the house felt different. The tension that had simmered quietly for weeks now buzzed in the air, heavier and impossible to ignore. Mark sat at the dining table with his coffee, his gaze distant as he scrolled through his phone. Liam was nowhere to be seen, but I knew he was still in the house. His presence was a weight I could feel even without seeing him. I tried to go about my morning routine, but every movement felt mechanical, every breath labored. Mark's occasional glances in my direction seemed sharper, as if he was trying to see beneath the surface. I kept my responses short and polite, hoping to escape the room before anything could unravel. But then he spoke, his voice startling in the quiet. "We need to talk." I froze, my heart pounding. "About what?" Mark set his phone down, his eyes locking onto mine. "About you, about us." He paused, his jaw tightening. "About Liam." The room seemed to tilt, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He watched me closely, his expression a mixture of hurt and quiet anger. "I'm not stupid," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've noticed the way you've been around him, the way he looks at you, the way you avoid meeting my eyes when I ask if you're okay." "Mark, I began, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "Let me finish," he said, his tone cutting. "I don't want to believe it, but I need you to be honest with me. Is there something going on between you two?" The weight of his question crushed me. I wanted to lie, to deny everything, to preserve what little was left of the life we had built together. But the look in his eyes, the raw vulnerability, the quiet plea for the truth, made it impossible. "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. "There is." Mark's face crumpled, and he leaned back in his chair as if the wind had been knocked out of him. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and the silence was unbearable. "How long?" he asked finally, his voice breaking. "Not long," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Mark. I swear I didn't, but it did," he said bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "And now what? You think you can just walk away from everything we've built? From me?" "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice shaking. "I don't know what to do. I'm so sorry." Mark stared at me, his expression shifting from hurt to anger. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you betrayed me." I flinched at his words, guilt stabbing through me like a knife. "I didn't mean to hurt you, but you did," he said, his voice rising. "And now I have to live with that." Before I could respond, Liam walked into the room, his eyes immediately darting between Mark and me. He must have sensed the tension because he stopped in his tracks, his expression guarded. "What's going on?" Liam asked cautiously. Mark turned to him, his eyes blazing. "Why don't you tell me, since you seem to have no problem inserting yourself into things that don't belong to you?" Liam's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said quietly. "But it's not just me. It's both of us." Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Of course you'd say that. You think you know her? You think you can offer her something better than I can?" "This isn't about who's better," Liam shot back. "It's about how she feels." "How she feels," Mark repeated, his voice laced with anger. "Do you even know what you're talking about? She doesn't need some impulsive, reckless fling. She needs stability, security, things you can't give her." "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of it all. "Just stop. This isn't helping anyone." The room fell silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Mark turned to me, his expression full of pain. "You need to decide," he said, his voice trembling. "Right now, him or me." The ultimatum hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, my heart pounding as I looked between them. Mark, who had given me a life I thought I wanted, and Liam, who had awakened something in me I couldn't ignore. "I can't," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I can't make that choice right now." "You already have," Mark said bitterly, pushing back his chair and storming out of the room. Liam stayed where he was, his eyes locked on me. He didn't say anything, didn't move to comfort me. He just waited, letting the weight of my decision, or lack of one, settle over us both. As the front door slammed shut behind Mark, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The life I had tried so hard to hold on to was gone, and the path ahead was uncertain, full of pain and regret and the faintest glimmer of something new. I had made my choice even if I hadn't spoken it aloud, and now I had to live with it.